Along a deserted stretch of highway, a prison transport van swerved erratically, its movements betraying the chaos unfolding inside. The men who stumbled from the wreckage were not just escaping, they were claiming their freedom through brute force. When they spotted a lone bystander, a black man stepping out of his pickup truck, they saw him as nothing more than another obstacle. But what they saw was a lie, because this was a man forged in the fires of combat, a former Navy SEAL who had spent years mastering the art of survival and war. He did not hesitate. He did not back down. What they didn't realize was that by attacking him, they had sealed their fate. He wasn't just a witness to their escape. He was the only man who could track them down. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The midday sun burned high in the sky, casting a relentless heat over the open highway. The road stretched for miles in both directions, nothing but fields and the occasional cluster of trees breaking up the endless horizon. Marcus Ward had been driving for over an hour, his truck's air conditioning doing little to keep the heat at bay. It was another long drive after another security job, another day spent keeping people safe from threats that never really materialized. Civilian life had its quiet moments, but Marcus was never the type to enjoy them. Up ahead, a large white van caught his attention. It was a prison transport, easily identifiable by the reinforced back doors and the thick metal grates covering the side windows. He had passed plenty of them before, but something about this one made him sit up a little straighter. The van swerved slightly to the right, corrected itself, then swerved again. The movements weren't natural, not the usual drifting of a tired driver or a mechanical issue. Someone inside was fighting for control. Marcus watched closely, his instincts immediately on edge. The van rocked again, and this time he could see the sudden jerking motions of a struggle happening inside. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A dark blue sedan that had been trailing the van began slowing down, its driver likely just as wary. The transport wasn't just having trouble. It was under attack. A loud bang erupted from the back of the van, and the entire vehicle jolted. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter. Another hard slam came from inside, metal bending under the force of something, or someone, trying to break free. The van swerved again, harder this time, nearly tipping onto two wheels before the driver regained control. The brakes locked up, tires screeching against the pavement as the van skidded onto the shoulder, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. Marcus slowed his truck, keeping a safe distance. His gut told him to stay put, but his instincts screamed otherwise. He scanned the area. The highway was empty aside from him and the other car. No backup was coming for whoever was inside that van. No sirens, no flashing lights. It was just him, the blue sedan, and whatever was about to come out of that transport. The sedan made its decision first. The driver threw it into reverse, tires squealing as they spun the car around and sped off in the opposite direction. They weren't going to wait and see what happened next. Marcus wasn't surprised. Not everyone had it in them to walk toward danger, but he had never been the type to back down. The van's driver's side door swung open, and a uniformed officer stumbled out. His forehead was split open, blood dripping down the side of his face, but he was still standing. His name tag read Hughes, and he gripped a baton in one hand while his other clutched at his side. A second officer, Denton, emerged from the passenger seat, gun drawn but unsteady. Neither looked like they had full control of the situation. Then, from the back of the van, the doors burst open. The first man out hit the ground running. Tall, broad, his orange jumpsuit soaked with sweat, he moved with the kind of confidence that only came from years of surviving in the hardest places imaginable. His fists were already clenched, muscles coiled like springs as he surveyed the scene. His eyes locked onto Hughes, and for a second there was nothing but understanding between them. Then he charged. The other prisoners poured out behind him, moving fast, spreading out. Hughes barely had time to react before the first punch landed square in his ribs. He grunted, staggering back, baton raised in a weak defense. Denton fired a shot into the air, but it did nothing to stop the rush of bodies coming straight for him. Marcus moved. He didn't think about it. He just reacted. The nearest prisoner had his back turned, rushing toward Denton with his hands raised like he was ready to rip the gun away. Marcus reached him first, wrapping an arm around his neck and yanking him backward. The man gasped, arms flailing as he tried to fight off the chokehold. But Marcus wasn't letting go. He twisted sharply, throwing the man down hard onto the pavement. Denton, still trying to keep his gun aimed, was shoved violently against the van, his head slamming against the metal. Another prisoner, wiry and wild-eyed, grabbed his wrist, trying to rip the gun away. Denton struggled, his strength failing fast. A second later, the gun was gone, knocked from his grip and skidding across the pavement. Marcus saw the exact moment Denton realized he was losing. Hughes was still fighting, landing a solid hit with his baton against one of the inmates, but he was slowing down. Another prisoner rushed him from behind, and a second later, Hughes was on the ground, arms pinned, teeth gritted in pain. The prisoners were winning. Marcus grabbed the fallen gun, flipping it in his hands, keeping the barrel low but ready. His presence was finally noticed. The man who had led the charge turned toward him, eyes narrowing. James Bull Howard. Even without knowing his name, Marcus recognized the way he carried himself. He wasn't just another thug. He was something worse. A man who had spent his life climbing to the top of whatever pile of bodies stood between him and power. Bull smirked, stepping forward slowly. "Didn't expect extra company," he said, voice steady, almost amused. "This your fight, stranger?" Marcus tightened his grip on the gun. "You made it my fight." Bull nodded, like he respected that answer. Then he moved, fast for a man his size. Before Marcus could fire, Bull grabbed Denton's body and yanked him in front of him like a human shield. Marcus had no shot. Before Marcus could adjust, another prisoner lunged from the side, grabbing the gun's barrel. Marcus twisted hard, ripping it free and delivering a brutal elbow to the man's jaw. But another fist smashed into his ribs. More of them swarmed. He fired a shot toward the dirt, forcing them to hesitate, but it only lasted a second. One of them tackled him from behind, and suddenly Marcus was caught in the chaos. The fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. Marcus barely had time to steady himself before Bull Howard moved again, his massive frame closing the distance with terrifying speed. Marcus braced for another charge, trying to maneuver, but the prisoners were pressing in from all sides, making it impossible to find an opening. Bull swung wide, aiming for his ribs, and Marcus barely managed to twist in time to absorb the impact against his side instead of taking it full force. Even so, the sheer power behind the punch sent him stumbling back, his boots skidding across the pavement as pain flared through his body. Hughes had managed to free himself from the prisoner, pinning him down, and was still fighting, though it was clear he was running on fumes. His uniform was torn, blood trickling from a cut near his temple, but he fought with the desperation of a man who refused to die on his knees. He blocked an incoming punch with his forearm, twisting the attacker's wrist and landing a brutal elbow to the side of his head before grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him into the van. The metal rang out from the impact, but Hughes wasn't done. He reached for the prisoner's arm and forced it behind his back, using the leverage to bend him forward, pinning him against the vehicle. For a brief moment, it looked like he had regained control. But another inmate blindsided him, delivering a vicious kick to the back of his knee. Hughes let out a grunt of pain as his leg buckled, losing his grip on the man he had restrained. A second later, a fist smashed into his jaw, followed by another to the stomach. And just like that, he was on the ground again. Denton wasn't faring much better. One of the prisoners had him pinned against the hood of the van, gripping his throat with both hands as he struggled to pry the man's fingers off. He gasped for breath, his face reddening from the pressure. But he didn't stop fighting. He drove his knee upward, catching his attacker in the groin, forcing him to release his grip. Denton coughed violently, sucking in air. But before he could fully recover, another prisoner grabbed him from behind. yanking his arms back. The fight was turning into a war of attrition, and Marcus could see it happening in real time. The longer they fought, the more the prisoners adapted, using their numbers to wear them down. Every hit Marcus landed was met with 3 in return. Every brief moment of control was torn away just as quickly as it had been gained. Bull came at him again, swinging low this time, aiming for his ribs. Marcus dodged to the side, countering with a sharp strike to the throat. The impact made Bull grunt, his stance faltering for half a second. But that was all. He recovered instantly, stepping forward and slamming his forehead into Marcus's skull in a brutal headbutt. Marcus felt the impact rattle through his entire body, his vision flashing white for a moment before darkness threatened to creep in. He staggered back, trying to shake it off, but Bull didn't let up. He grabbed Marcus by the shirt and threw him toward the van. Marcus barely had time to throw his arms up before his back collided with the metal. The force of it knocked the air from his lungs, but he didn't get the chance to recover before a fist slammed into his stomach. Another followed, then another, and with every hit, Marcus felt himself losing ground. His knees wobbled, his body screaming in protest, but he refused to fall. Bull took a step back, looking him over like a man inspecting his work. "Still standing," he muttered, shaking his head. "You don't break easy, do you?" Marcus spat blood onto the pavement and glared up at him, breathing heavily. "Neither do you," he rasped. Bull grinned, nodding in approval. "You're all right, big man. But this ain't your fight." Before Marcus could respond, a boot slammed into the side of his knee. The pain shot through his leg like fire, and this time his body gave in. He collapsed onto one knee, his hands barely catching him before he hit the ground completely. He could hear Hughes struggling nearby, his grunts of pain mixing with Denton's ragged breathing as the 2 men were slowly beaten into submission. One of the prisoners reached down and grabbed Denton's fallen gun, testing its weight in his hand. "We got ourselves some real firepower now," he said, his voice laced with satisfaction. Another inmate chuckled. "This just keeps getting better." Bull crouched beside Marcus, his tone almost friendly. "Here's the deal. We're gonna be on our way. You're gonna stay right here, licking your wounds, and this little fight we had is gonna stay in the past." He patted Marcus's shoulder, like he was giving him a piece of brotherly advice. "Because if I see you again, I won't leave you breathing next time." Marcus locked eyes with him, every muscle in his body tense with rage. But he didn't say a word. Bull stood, turning toward the other inmates. "Let's go." They moved fast. One of the prisoners ran toward Marcus's truck, climbing into the driver's seat and starting the engine. Another grabbed Hughes's baton, twirling it in his fingers like a toy before tossing it into the back seat of the stolen vehicle. The others climbed in, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the low rumble of the engine. Bull lingered for a second longer, watching Marcus with something that almost looked like respect. Then he climbed into the passenger seat, slammed the door shut, and the truck peeled out onto the road, kicking up a cloud of dust as it sped away. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. His body wasn't cooperating, his muscles refusing to respond. His ribs burned, his face throbbed, and his vision swam. But none of it mattered. The only thing that filled his mind, overriding the pain, was one simple, undeniable truth. This wasn't over. They had won the battle. But the war was just beginning. The sound of Marcus's stolen truck faded into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the eerie silence of the highway. The fight was over, but his body still felt every second of it. The dull throb in his ribs, the sharp sting on his knuckles, the lingering burn in his muscles from forcing himself to keep moving when he should have been on the ground. His head swam, but he shook it off. The battle had ended, but there were still things to do. He forced himself to move, staggering toward the transport van. His first instinct was to check on the guards, but something nagged at the back of his mind. The driver. He hadn't seen him since this started. His body ached with every step as he pushed forward, gripping the side of the van for support. He peered inside the cab, scanning for movement. But the driver wasn't visible. The door was still closed, but there was a dark smear of blood on the glass. Marcus moved around the front, his boots kicking up loose gravel, and finally saw him. The driver, a man in his late 40s with graying hair at his temples, was slumped against the steering wheel. His uniform darkened with sweat and dust. Blood streaked down the side of his face from a deep gash above his left eyebrow. His breathing was shallow, but at least he was still alive. Marcus reached in and pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck. The pulse was faint but steady. He exhaled, relieved that the driver hadn't been killed outright. If Bull had wanted him dead, he would have made it happen. A groan came from the man as Marcus shook his shoulder. "Hey, you with me?" The driver stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering as he tried to regain consciousness. He mumbled something incoherent, his head lolling to the side before he groaned again, louder this time. His eyes opened halfway, glassy and unfocused, but at least he was waking up. Marcus reached for the seatbelt and unbuckled him, then leaned in to prop him up. "You need to stay awake," he said firmly. "Can you hear me?" The man winced, his fingers twitching slightly before he managed a weak nod. "What?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You got hit," Marcus told him. "Hard. Probably got a concussion." The driver swallowed thickly, blinking slowly before his breathing steadied a little. His eyes darted around, taking in the wreckage, the open doors of the van, the absence of the prisoners. His face twisted as realization sank in. "Shit," he muttered. "They got out?" "Yeah," Marcus said grimly. "Took out your men, took my truck, and got the hell out of here." The driver let out a harsh breath, closing his eyes for a second like he was processing everything. When he opened them again, there was frustration behind them, mixed with pain. "Hughes and Denton?" Marcus looked back toward the 2 guards. "Alive. Barely." The driver exhaled, nodding slightly. "Damn! I tried to stop them." The second the van started shaking, I radioed in for help, but his hand moved weakly toward his side. "They got me before I could finish the call." Marcus followed his motion and saw the radio clipped to his belt. The casing cracked like it had been smashed against something. The prisoners must have attacked him first before making their move. It explained why backup hadn't arrived yet. "You remember anything before you went out?" Marcus asked. The driver winced again, rubbing his temple as if the pain would help him think. The van swerved. Felt like something hit the side. Next thing I knew, I saw Bull Howard's face through the partition. "I don't know how the hell he got loose so fast, but he let out a bitter chuckle. Man punched through that damn divider like it was made of cardboard." Marcus had no trouble believing that. "I hit the brakes," the driver continued, "but I didn't even have time to reach for my gun before the doors swung open. I saw hands grabbing at me. Next thing I knew, something slammed into my head. Don't remember much after that." Marcus sighed, stepping back and running a hand over his face. It all made sense now. This wasn't just a spontaneous breakout. They had outside help. Someone was waiting for them. The driver must have read something in Marcus's expression because his brow furrowed. "What?" Marcus shook his head. "This was planned. Bull didn't just break out. He had someone waiting. The way the van lost control, that wasn't an accident. Someone made sure it happened here, in the middle of nowhere." The driver cursed under his breath. "Of course they did." Marcus turned toward Hughes and Denton, who were still struggling to pull themselves together. He crouched beside Hughes first, pressing 2 fingers to his pulse. Still weak, but steady. Hughes's eyes cracked open slightly. Groggy, but aware. "You still with me?" Marcus asked. Hughes groaned, but managed a nod. Unfortunately, Denton was still on his side, coughing as he tried to sit up. His uniform was torn, his badge caked in dirt and blood. He looked like hell, but at least he was conscious. "They got away," Denton muttered, rubbing his swollen jaw. Marcus exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Yeah. Took my truck, too." Denton let out a humorless chuckle. "Hell of a day." Hughes grimaced as he sat up, moving slowly like every muscle in his body was screaming in protest. "They had this planned from the start," Marcus nodded. "The sedan that was tailing you? That was part of it. The second the van lost control, the driver bailed." Denton frowned. So they had someone following them the whole way? Or waiting for the right moment? Marcus said. Either way, they weren't working alone. Hughes let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting toward the road. We're screwed. Marcus shook his head. Not yet. Denton scoffed. Unless you got some miracle plan to track these guys down without backup, I'd say we're pretty damn close. Marcus didn't respond right away. His mind was already working, already sorting through everything he knew about Bull Howard, everything he had seen in the fight, everything the guards had told him. They weren't just running, they were following a plan. And if there was one thing Marcus knew how to do, it was hunting down men who thought they were untouchable. An hour later, the distant hum of engines grew louder, turning into a full-on roar as flashing red and blue lights cut through the heat haze. A convoy of state police vehicles and FBI SUVs sped toward the scene, sirens piercing the stillness of the highway. The backup had finally arrived. Too late to stop anything, too late to matter. Marcus rolled his shoulders, ignoring the pain lacing through his ribs as he turned toward the approaching cars. He wasn't looking forward to explaining this to people who hadn't been here, who hadn't fought for their lives and lost. They'd have their procedures, their theories, their long-winded discussions. None of that would get his truck back. None of that would put Bull Howard back in chains. The first state trooper barely had his car in park before he threw the door open, stepping out with one hand on his holster. Another officer followed, scanning the scene, their expressions sharp and alert. One of them, a thick-built man with sergeant stripes on his sleeve, wasted no time. Jesus Christ! What the hell happened here? Hughes, still seated against the side of the transport van, groaned as he wiped at the blood trickling from his nose. What does it look like? We got our asses handed to us. The trooper's gaze shifted to Marcus, eyes narrowing. And who the hell are you? Marcus pulled his wallet from his pocket, flipping it open and handing over his ID. The officer grabbed it, scanning the name with suspicion before his expression flickered, recognition dawning across his face. Marcus Ward? His tone had shifted, the same way a man's voice changes when he realizes he's talking to someone he should know. You're... Before he could finish the thought, the last SUV rolled up, its door swinging open. A woman in a fitted dark suit and FBI windbreaker stepped out, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene with clinical precision. She was tall, lean, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes missing nothing. The FBI lettering on her jacket made it clear she wasn't just another cop. She walked toward the group, her focus landing on Hughes first. "You're the lead officer." Hughes exhaled. "I was." She turned toward Marcus, her eyes lingering on his bruised face, his torn shirt, the blood drying on his knuckles. Her expression barely shifted, but something flickered in her gaze. "Who's he?" she asked, directing the question at the trooper. The officer handed over Marcus's ID. "Says his name is Marcus Ward." She took the ID, her brow furrowing as she read the name, then her lips parted slightly, a hint of recognition flashing across her face. "Wait," she muttered. "The Marcus Ward?" The way she said it told Marcus everything he needed to know. She'd heard of him. The silence that followed was telling. Even the trooper who had been demanding answers took a small step back. This wasn't just a name to them. It was a reputation. Conway turned the ID over in her fingers, as if confirming it was real, before looking back at him. Marcus Ward, former Navy SEAL, 3 combat tours, counterterrorism, classified ops. Her eyes flicked over his stance, assessing. "Last I heard, you disappeared off the radar." Marcus crossed his arms. "I was done being on the radar." Conway studied him a moment longer before handing his ID back. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't intimidated either. But she respected the name, whether she wanted to or not. She shifted her focus back to the scene. What the hell happened here? Marcus slid his wallet back into his pocket. 8 prisoners staged a breakout, overpowered the guards, took my truck, disappeared. Conway turned toward Hughes. "And you let that happen?" Hughes scoffed. "Like we had a choice. These guys weren't idiots. They had this planned." Marcus nodded. This wasn't random. They knew where to strike, how to move, and they had help. The van didn't lose control by accident. Someone on the outside made sure it happened. Conway exhaled sharply, muttering something under her breath before shaking her head. Damn it! She pulled out her phone, scrolling through something before looking back up. We've got a team already locking down the nearby highways. If they haven't gotten too far, we'll find them. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's not fast enough, one of the troopers scoffed. Oh yeah? You got a better idea? Marcus turned toward him, his stare hard. Yeah, go after them now, instead of waiting for a bureaucratic order to tell you it's okay. The trooper wasn't expecting that answer. He shifted uncomfortably. But it was Conway who spoke first. And what? You think you're just gonna track them yourself? Marcus didn't hesitate. If I have to. Conway let out a short, humorless laugh. You were a SEAL, not a cop. There's a difference between hunting insurgents and tracking down fugitives. Marcus's gaze was unyielding. Not to me. For the first time, she looked at him like she was actually considering the possibility. Like she was wondering if maybe this was the kind of man who could do what others couldn't. Then she exhaled sharply. Fine. You want to chase these guys? You do it on my terms. We find them together. Marcus nodded once. Then let's get started. The manhunt had begun. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked FBI SUV, his arms crossed as the vehicle sped down the highway. The smell of stale coffee and old upholstery filled the cabin, but he barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking about where Bull Howard and his men could be right now. Agent Conway drove with a controlled intensity, her grip firm on the wheel, her posture rigid. She hadn't spoken much since they left the crime scene, only offering clipped responses when necessary. It was obvious she wasn't thrilled about him being here. He wasn't law enforcement, wasn't part of her team, and she didn't like variables she couldn't control. He didn't care. He wasn't in this for protocol. He was in this for results. Conway tapped the tablet mounted on the dashboard, pulling up a file. The 8 men who escaped, Bull Howard, Paul Grady, Rick Monroe, Eddie Vasquez, Tony Birch, Kyle Shepard, Reggie Bowen, and James Locke. 6 violent offenders, 1 armed robber, 1 con man. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He recognized some of those names. Bull is the leader. Grady is the muscle. Monroe and Vasquez are loyal, the type who don't question orders. Birch and Shepard are small-time, but dangerous in groups. Bowen is the coward, the first one who's going to break when things get tough. And Locke, he exhaled, shaking his head. Locke's the smart one. He's the one who put this plan together. Conway glanced at him. You seem sure. I know how men like them think, Marcus said. They didn't do this just to run. They have a plan. Her phone buzzed, and she put it on speaker. Go ahead. A voice crackled through. We got a hit. Gas station, 82 miles north of the breakout point. Your target vehicle stopped for 3 minutes, then took off again. Marcus straightened. 3 minutes? The agent on the other end hesitated. Yeah, but that's not the interesting part. While the truck was there, another vehicle pulled up, a black SUV. One of the escapees got inside and left in the opposite direction. Conway's expression tightened. They're splitting up. Marcus nodded. And that means they're running out of time. They're smart enough to know they can't stay together. They've got a plan, and part of it starts here. Conway pressed the accelerator, the SUV picking up speed as they barreled down the open highway. The next few minutes passed in tense silence, both of them locked in thought. It was a simple maneuver, but an effective one. The group had stuck together long enough to get clear, but now the smart ones were breaking off. Anyone splitting off was making themselves more vulnerable. But it also meant they had somewhere to go. A contact. A safe house. Something prearranged. Marcus knew exactly what that meant. The hunt was about to get a lot harder. The gas station sat at the side of the highway, a lonely outpost in the middle of nowhere. Faded signs advertised fuel, cold drinks, and lottery tickets. The pumps were old, the kind that still required a manual latch, and the main building looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. They pulled in fast, tires crunching against the gravel lot. Marcus was already stepping out before the SUV had fully stopped, scanning the area. A trucker leaned against his rig, watching them without much interest, and an older man in jeans and a flannel stood by the ice cooler, lighting a cigarette. Inside, a kid barely out of his teens sat behind the counter, half asleep. Conway pushed open the glass door, flashing her badge the moment she stepped inside. FBI. We need to see your security footage. The kid at the counter blinked in confusion. Yeah, sure, but Marcus didn't have patience for hesitation. He stepped up beside her, fixing the clerk with a hard stare. We're looking for a stolen truck. Someone in it got into another vehicle here. Tell us what you saw. The kid hesitated, his eyes darting between them. I wasn't really paying attention. Marcus set his hand down on the counter, his voice firm. Think again. His face went pale. Okay. Yeah, there was a truck. Beat-up thing. A bunch of guys in it. They pulled in fast, like they were in a hurry. One of them jumped out and got into another car that was waiting near the pumps. Then they both left. Marcus leaned in. What did the driver of the SUV look like? The kid swallowed. Didn't get a good look. White guy, big, lot of tattoos on his arms, had a scar near his eye. Marcus's expression darkened. Paul Grady. Conway raised an eyebrow. You know him? Yeah, Marcus muttered. Ex-biker. Ran with a white supremacist gang before he got locked up. Tough, mean, but not too bright. If he split from Bull, it means he's got his own plan. He's not following orders anymore. Conway's tone sharpened. Did they say anything? The clerk nodded quickly. Yeah, the guy who got in the SUV said something like, "See you in the city." Then he laughed and left. Marcus's mind was already working. Which city? The kid shrugged helplessly. Didn't say. Conway exhaled, pulling out her phone. We've got 2 leads. The main group's still heading north, but Grady and someone else went somewhere else entirely. She tapped a few commands into her device. We need to decide who to chase. Marcus was already looking toward the road. If Grady's cutting loose, he's not meeting up with Bull again. He's got his own angle, and if he's heading into a city, that means he's got contacts. Someone who owes him a favor, someone willing to hide him. Conway's voice was measured. Bull's still the priority. Marcus turned toward her. Your team's already going after him. I can track Grady myself. She narrowed her eyes. You don't get to make that call. I just did. She sighed, rubbing her temple. If you do this, you do it my way. I want updates. No reckless decisions. Marcus gave a short nod. Fine. Conway hesitated for a second, then motioned toward her SUV. I'll drop you at the nearest field office. You can gear up and take another vehicle. Marcus was already moving toward the door. Let's go. The hunt had just begun. Marcus stepped out of the SUV as it rolled to a stop outside the nearest FBI field office, a squat, nondescript brick building tucked away off the highway. No flashing lights, no obvious signage, just a place meant to blend in, housing agents who operated outside the public eye. Conway barely put the car in park before she was already moving, pulling her phone from her pocket as she walked toward the entrance. You have 20 minutes, she said over her shoulder. Get what you need and get moving. We can't afford to lose time. Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't wasting time arguing when he had work to do. Inside, the office was functional but bare. Agents moved briskly through the space, heads down, focused on their tasks. No one spared him more than a passing glance, though he caught a few looks of recognition as he passed. Conway had barely introduced him, but his name still carried weight, even here. She led him into a side room where an open equipment case was already waiting for him. It wasn't anything special, just the standard gear law enforcement used when tracking fugitives. A tactical vest, reinforced boots, gloves, a sidearm. Marcus ignored the vest and went for the gloves first, flexing his fingers against the padded knuckles. The pistol was a Glock 19, standard issue, but reliable. He checked the magazine, then holstered it at his waist without a second thought. Across the room, Conway was already pulling up new intel on a monitor. A satellite image of the gas station filled the screen, a red line marking the stolen truck's movement north. A second marker highlighted the SUV, that had taken off in the opposite direction. Marcus finished gearing up and stepped beside her. "What do we have?" Conway didn't look away from the screen. "The truck's still moving. No stops yet. My team is mobilizing to intercept, but that's a wide stretch of highway, and they could ditch it at any time." She tapped a few keys, zooming in on the second marker. "The SUV, though, that one's different. It pulled off the highway 30 miles from the gas station, turned onto a secondary road, and then disappeared from traffic cameras. No highway re-entry. That means Grady is in a town or city." Marcus studied the map. "What's nearby?" Conway clicked again, bringing up a local map. 2 towns within that radius, Redfield and Knox. Redfield's small, mostly farmland. Not a place you'd hide unless you had someone waiting for you. Knox is bigger. Old industrial town, run down, lot of abandoned buildings. She paused, glancing at him. "If you were him, where would you go?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Knox. He's got ties to outlaw biker gangs. The kind of guys who still operate out of bars that haven't changed since the 80s. If he's cutting loose, he's looking for muscle. He's looking for a crew." Conway exhaled. "That's what I thought, too." She turned, facing him fully. "You get there, you confirm he's in the area, and you call it in. No lone hero act. My team is still running point on this." Marcus gave her a dry look. "If I see him, I'm not letting him slip away." She clenched her jaw. "This isn't a game." "It never is." They stared at each other for a long moment before she exhaled, shaking her head. "Fine. Just don't get yourself killed." Marcus took the keys she handed him and headed for the door. The drive to Knox took less than 40 minutes. The road narrowed as he neared the town, the buildings growing older, the sidewalks emptier. Knox had the look of a place past its prime. Crumbling brick factories, faded signage, streets lined with bars that never saw much traffic. The kind of place men like Grady could disappear in. Marcus parked a block away from the center of town, stepping out and taking a slow breath. He wasn't wearing the tactical vest. He wanted to move unnoticed. His presence already stood out enough. He adjusted his jacket, tucking the holster at his waist just enough to keep it out of sight, but within reach. He moved through the streets with purpose, scanning faces, looking for signs of trouble. Bars, bike shops, gas stations, places where men like Grady gravitated. It didn't take long to find a lead. A group of men stood outside a dive bar, smoking, their jackets covered in patches and club insignias. Outlaws. Marcus approached slowly. One of them, a thick-built man with a shaved head, gave him a sideways glance. "Don't recognize you," he muttered. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Looking for someone." Shaved head scoffed. "Ain't we all?" Marcus ignored him, turning his gaze toward the bar entrance. "Paul Grady. He came through here, didn't he?" The air shifted immediately. A few of the men stopped talking, their gazes sharpening. Shaved head straightened slightly. "Never heard of him." Marcus didn't blink. "That's a lie." Silence stretched between them. A few of the bikers exchanged glances, their hands shifting slightly. Small movements, subtle, but Marcus saw it for what it was. They were considering their options. Shaved head exhaled through his nose. "Even if he was here, why would I tell you?" Marcus leaned in slightly. "Because I'm giving you a chance to stay out of this." Shaved head smirked, shaking his head. "You got some nerve." One of the others muttered, "Maybe we should show him what happens when people start asking the wrong questions." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "Try it." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Shaved head lunged first, swinging for Marcus's jaw, but Marcus was already moving. He sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, and twisted sharply. A crack echoed as the arm bent the wrong way, followed by a pained yell. Another biker rushed in. Marcus drove his knee into the man's ribs, knocking him back before pivoting, grabbing a third by the jacket and slamming him into the wall. The rest hesitated, realizing too late that they'd miscalculated. Marcus let go of the last man, stepping back. "Who wants to go next?" No one moved. Shaved head groaned, cradling his broken wrist. "He was here," he spat. "Didn't stay long. He met with someone. Some guy in a suit. Looked clean cut." Not like us, he exhaled. They left together. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Where? Shaved head hesitated, then jerked his chin toward the end of the street. Old warehouse district. That's all I know. Marcus nodded once, stepping back. Smart choice. He turned and walked away, already calculating his next move. Grady was close, and Marcus was going to find him. Marcus walked down the dimly lit street, his boots making almost no sound against the cracked pavement. The old warehouse district stretched ahead, a collection of abandoned buildings covered in graffiti, their broken windows staring out like empty sockets. The place had long since been left to rot, the kind of area where no one asked questions, where business was handled in the dark. Grady was here. Marcus could feel it. The biker had given up the information too easily. He wasn't smart enough to fake fear, and his broken wrist meant he had no reason to protect Grady. That meant the fugitive had met someone in a suit, someone clean-cut. That detail bothered Marcus. Grady wasn't the type to deal with businessmen. He was a blunt object, a battering ram. But if he was meeting someone important, that meant there was a bigger plan at play. Marcus stopped at the corner of a side alley, scanning the area. A few scattered streetlights flickered weakly, offering little visibility. The further he went, the more the street dipped into silence. No pedestrians, no traffic. Just the low hum of the wind cutting between rusted buildings. Then he saw it. Half a block ahead, an old warehouse with a loading dock had one single light on inside. The glow spilled out from a high window, cutting through the darkness. More importantly, a black SUV was parked outside, idling. No plates, tinted windows. Grady was inside. Marcus exhaled slowly, shifting his stance. He didn't rush in. He had learned long ago that impatience got men killed. Instead, he crouched behind an old dumpster, watching. After a moment, the warehouse door creaked open, and two figures emerged. The first was Paul Grady, still wearing the same prison-issued jeans and undershirt, though he'd thrown a jacket over it to blend in. He moved with confidence, but his shoulders were tight, his body language uneasy. He was looking over his shoulder, checking the shadows. Paranoid. The second man, however, was the one who caught Marcus's attention. He was tall, mid-40s, well-dressed in a charcoal suit. Even in the dim light, Marcus could tell he wasn't just some lackey. He had the demeanor of someone in control, someone used to giving orders, not taking them. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable. Grady spoke first. "This better be solid. I didn't ditch Howard just to run in circles." The man in the suit didn't react. "It's solid." His voice was calm, even. "But you need to hold up your end." Grady scoffed. "Yeah? And what's that?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A phone. He handed it to Grady. Marcus tensed. "This is your next contact," the man said. "You check in with them, and they'll set you up. After that, you disappear." Grady turned the phone over in his hands, frowning. "Why all this trouble? What do you get out of it?" The man smiled faintly. "That's not your concern." Marcus's instinct screamed at him. This wasn't just about Grady escaping. This was organized. Someone was helping them disappear. Someone with connections. He reached for his own phone, pulling it from his pocket without taking his eyes off the scene. He scrolled to Conway's number and hit call. She picked up instantly. "Tell me you found something." Marcus kept his voice low. "I've got Grady. He's meeting someone. Older guy, suit, high-level contact. They're setting him up with a new identity." There was a pause on her end. Then her tone shifted, sharper. "A suit? Are you sure?" "Yeah, he's giving Grady a phone. Instructions. This is bigger than a breakout." "Hold position," Conway said. "I'll send backup." Marcus exhaled, watching as Grady pocketed the phone. "They'll be gone by then. We're not doing this alone." Marcus didn't answer. The man in the suit turned, motioning toward the SUV. "Your ride is waiting. I suggest you take it." Grady hesitated for half a second. Then he nodded. "Yeah, fine." Marcus made his decision. He moved. Stepping out of the shadows, he crossed the distance fast, boots silent against the pavement. The moment he was in range, he called out, "Grady!" Both men snapped their heads up. Grady's face twisted in recognition. "Oh, come on!" Marcus didn't give him time to react. He closed the gap, grabbing Grady's jacket and slamming him against the SUV. The impact knocked the air out of him, and before Grady could recover, Marcus drove his elbow into his stomach. Grady grunted, doubling over. But Marcus wasn't done. He wrenched Grady's arm behind his back, twisting hard enough to keep him still. The man in the suit took a step back, his face remaining eerily calm. "You're making a mistake," he said. Marcus ignored him. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head. "Who do you think I am?" Marcus tightened his grip on Grady's arm, eliciting a sharp hiss of pain. "Someone who doesn't belong in this." The man exhaled, then glanced toward the SUV. The driver's side door opened, and a third figure stepped out. A bodyguard, broad-shouldered and silent. Marcus's eyes flicked toward him. His stance, his movement, trained. Not just some hired thug. The bodyguard reached into his jacket. Marcus didn't wait to find out what he was reaching for. He yanked Grady sideways, using him as a shield as he pivoted. The bodyguard barely had time to react before Marcus drove his boot into his knee, sending him collapsing onto the pavement. The man grunted, reaching for something in his coat, but Marcus grabbed his wrist and twisted hard, forcing whatever he was holding to clatter to the ground. The man in the suit didn't flinch. He simply sighed. "Well," he muttered, "that complicates things." Marcus held his ground, his pulse steady. "You're going to tell me who you work for." The man's gaze flickered toward the fallen bodyguard, then back to Marcus. Then, for the first time, his calm expression cracked. Because in the distance, sirens were approaching. Conway's backup was coming. Marcus kept his grip on Grady, his focus never wavering. He had him, but now he needed answers. Marcus kept his grip on Grady, his muscles taut as the fugitive twisted against the hold. He wasn't getting away. The man was breathing hard, chest rising and falling in quick bursts, but there was no fear in his eyes. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting. The wail of sirens grew louder as the FBI convoy tore through the empty streets, tires screeching to a halt outside the warehouse. Red and blue lights flooded the area, bouncing off the crumbling brick walls. Agents poured out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, spreading across the scene with mechanical efficiency. The bodyguard on the ground groaned, but stayed down, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The man in the suit, William Carter, stood with his hands already raised, his face blank, eyes betraying nothing. Conway stepped out of the lead SUV, her weapon trained on Carter. She barely spared Grady a glance before signaling two agents forward. They secured Grady immediately, wrenching his arms behind his back and shoving him against the hood of a patrol car. He let out a huff of laughter, but didn't resist. "You're wasting your time," Grady muttered. "You think this means anything? You're still behind." Marcus stepped closer, his voice steady, his presence looming. "Then catch me up." Grady smirked. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Conway ignored him, turning her focus to Carter. "Cuff him," she ordered, her voice sharp. An agent moved in, securing zip ties around Carter's wrists. The older man didn't flinch, didn't resist, because he had already accepted this outcome. That made Marcus uneasy. "You're making a mistake," Carter said calmly. Conway stepped closer, her expression cold. "Helping fugitives escape federal custody isn't a mistake. It's a crime." Carter exhaled, looking at her with something almost resembling pity. "You think this is about a few escaped prisoners?" He shook his head. "You have no idea what you're involved in." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Then start talking." Carter held his gaze, but didn't speak. He was waiting for something. That was enough for Marcus to know this wasn't over. Conway turned toward her team. "Take them both in. I want Carter in interrogation within the hour." The agents moved fast, loading both Grady and Carter into separate vehicles. Marcus lingered for a moment, scanning the warehouse, trying to piece together what was still missing. The escape wasn't random. The prisoners had help. But why? As the last of the FBI agents secured the scene, Conway motioned toward the SUVs. "We need to break Carter. He knows more than he's saying." Marcus didn't argue. They had work to do. The FBI field office was a stark contrast to the warehouse district, bright, sterile, and filled with the hum of quiet efficiency. Interrogation rooms lined the back halls, each one equipped with reinforced doors and thick, observation-proof glass. Marcus stood outside one of them, staring through the one-way mirror at William Carter. The man sat in the center of the room, hands cuffed to the table, his posture relaxed. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't protested his arrest. He simply waited. That unsettled Marcus more than anything. Carter wasn't nervous because he knew something they didn't. Conway stepped beside him, arms crossed. "You want to take the first shot?" Marcus didn't look away from the glass. "Let's see how he plays it." They stepped inside together. Carter's eyes flicked up as they entered, but he said nothing. Conway sat across from him, placing a file on the table. William Carter, former defense contractor, logistics coordinator, and now, she flipped a page, her tone flat. A man caught arranging safe passage for 8 federal fugitives. Carter didn't blink. "You're wasting time." Marcus took a seat beside Conway, leaning forward slightly. "That's funny, because from where I'm sitting, you're out of moves." Carter exhaled, shaking his head. "You really think this is about me?" Marcus studied him. "No, I think you're the middleman. But that means you know who's pulling the strings." Carter tilted his head slightly. "And what makes you think I'd give that up?" Conway leaned in. "Because you don't have a choice." She flipped another page in the file. "We already know you've been facilitating illegal movements across state lines for years. Arms, fugitives, intelligence leaks. You're good, but you slipped this time." She slid the file toward him. "And you're looking at 20 years minimum, unless you start cooperating." Carter smiled faintly. 20 years assumes I'll make it that far." Marcus's eyes sharpened. "That a threat?" "No," Carter said simply. "It's a fact." The room fell into a brief, heavy silence. Conway didn't break eye contact. "Who are you working for?" Carter finally leaned back, exhaling as if considering his words. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You're thinking about this the wrong way," he said. "You're chasing 8 men like they're fugitives. But they were never running." Marcus frowned. "Then what were they doing?" Carter's expression didn't change. "Getting into position." A cold weight settled in Marcus's gut. Conway stiffened. "Position for what?" Carter didn't answer. Conway pressed forward. "We already have Grady. The others will fall one by one. You have nothing left to protect." Carter's smile remained. "If that were true, you wouldn't still be in this room." Marcus clenched his fists. He knew the FBI had the resources to track every vehicle, every call, every movement. But they were still reacting. If Carter was right, then this wasn't about catching men on the run. This was about stopping something before it happened. He pushed back from the table. "We need to move now." Conway hesitated for only a second before nodding. She shot one last look at Carter. "Enjoy your cell." They left the room, Marcus already pulling out his phone. "Tell me we have an update on the others." An agent's voice crackled through the line. "We just got something. The stolen transport truck has stopped. It's sitting at a truck stop off Route 29. No movement for over an hour." Marcus didn't hesitate. "We're on our way." Conway was already moving toward the exit, relaying orders. Marcus followed, his mind racing. Carter hadn't flinched once. That meant the real danger hadn't even started, and they were already running out of time. The FBI convoy cut through the empty highway, headlights slicing through the darkness as they closed in on the truck stop off Route 29. The place was isolated, surrounded by miles of open road and patches of dense tree lines, the kind of stop truckers used for long hauls and where people could disappear if they knew how. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of the lead SUV, his jaw tight as he watched the landscape blur past. The stolen prison transport truck had been sitting at this location for over an hour, completely still. That meant one of two things. Either the fugitives had already switched vehicles and moved on, or they were still inside, waiting for the right moment to move. Neither option was good. Conway drove with controlled aggression, her fingers tapping against the steering wheel, her mind clearly working through the same possibilities. "We go in quiet," she said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "No sirens, no flashing lights. If they're still in that truck, I don't want them knowing we're here until we have every exit locked down. Marcus nodded. And if they're gone, then we find out what they left behind, she muttered, and we get ahead of them before they do this again. The radio crackled with an update from the tactical team following close behind. ETA 2 minutes. Perimeter units in place. No visible movement from the truck. Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening, his instincts kicking in. The truck stop came into view ahead. A dimly lit, mostly empty parking lot, the overhead lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. A few semi-trailers were lined up near the fueling station, their engines humming softly, but the area was mostly deserted. The stolen transport truck sat at the farthest end of the lot, partially obscured by a row of parked rigs. It looked completely abandoned, its driver's side door slightly ajar. That was a problem. If the fugitives had ditched the vehicle, why leave the door open? It was either a trap, a message, or a mistake. Conway pulled the SUV to a stop behind a cluster of parked cars. The rest of the convoy followed suit, fanning out silently. Agents moved with precise efficiency, setting up a loose perimeter around the truck, cutting off every escape route. Marcus stepped out, scanning the lot, his gaze moving from the transport truck to the surrounding vehicles. Something didn't feel right. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that came before something bad happened. Conway motioned for him to follow as they approached the truck, weapons low but ready. 2 tactical agents flanked them, moving in tandem, their footsteps barely audible over the hum of nearby diesel engines. The closer they got, the more Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. He reached out and pressed his palm against the truck's door. Cold. It had been sitting here for a while. He exchanged a glance with Conway, then slowly pushed it open. The inside was a mess. Blood smeared on the seats, torn restraints on the floor, discarded zip ties. But no fugitives. Conway frowned. They switched vehicles. Marcus stepped inside, scanning for anything useful. They did it here. Whatever they used next was waiting for them when they got here. He crouched, running his fingers over the dried blood on the seat. Someone was hurt. Either one of them, or... He stopped as his eyes landed on something just beneath the driver's seat. A discarded wristband. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. It was the kind hospitals or transport services used. It wasn't from the prisoners. Conway stepped closer. That's not from any of them. Marcus's stomach tightened. No. It's from a hostage. The implications hit hard and fast. The fugitives hadn't just switched vehicles. They had taken someone with them. Someone who was supposed to be in that truck, but wasn't anymore. Conway immediately keyed her radio. We need a full list of any reported missing persons within the last 6 hours. Focus on anyone traveling alone near this area. The response came back within minutes. We have a hit. A woman traveling alone was reported missing by her husband 2 hours ago. She made a stop at a gas station 30 miles from here and never arrived at her destination. Security footage shows her being forced into a vehicle by at least 2 men. Marcus exhaled, his grip tightening around the wristband. That's them. Conway nodded. They aren't just running anymore. They're using hostages as insurance. Marcus looked toward the open road beyond the truck stop. The fugitives had planned every step of this so far, and now they had someone to slow the FBI down. That changed the entire game. Conway's jaw tightened. If we don't move fast, we lose her. Marcus tossed the wristband back onto the seat and stepped away from the truck. His focus had never been sharper. This was no longer just a chase. This was a rescue mission, and he wasn't going to let them slip away. Marcus gripped the dashboard as Conway pushed the SUV past 90 miles per hour, tearing down the open highway in pursuit of their only lead. The fugitives were ahead of them, somewhere beyond the stretch of road disappearing into the night. They had a hostage now, which meant they had something to lose. That also meant they were going to fight harder, take bigger risks, and not go down easily. The FBI's surveillance team was working fast, feeding updates through the radio. We've got the vehicle. Silver pickup truck, stolen from a rest stop an hour ago. Last seen heading west on Route 17. Marcus processed that information immediately. They're doubling back. They know we're watching major highways, so they're taking secondary roads. Conway's grip tightened on the wheel. That'll buy them time, but it won't get them out of this. Another voice cut in over the radio. State troopers just flagged movement at a gas station 30 miles from your location. 2 men matching descriptions of the fugitives were spotted getting fuel. No sign of the hostage. Marcus's jaw clenched. That means the group split up. Conway glanced at him, her expression hard. We go in quiet. We take them down fast. They reached the gas station in less than 30 minutes, the lone outpost glowing under flickering fluorescent lights. A few vehicles sat parked outside, mostly truckers taking a break from the long road. But Marcus's attention locked onto a silver pickup sitting at the farthest pump. 2 men stood near it, talking in hushed voices. Rick Monroe and Eddie Vasquez, both escapees, both violent. Marcus exhaled, muscles tensing. That's them. Conway didn't hesitate. We move now. They stepped out of the SUV, keeping their weapons low but ready. 2 other FBI agents flanked them, moving in quickly. The moment Marcus took his first step forward, Monroe turned, eyes narrowing. For a second, there was stillness. Then, Vasquez's hand shot toward his waistband. Marcus moved first. He closed the distance in a blink, grabbing Vasquez's wrist before he could pull the gun free. He twisted hard, the weapon clattering onto the pavement, then drove his fist into the fugitive's ribs. Vasquez grunted, doubling over, but he wasn't done. Monroe lunged, swinging a wild punch aimed for Marcus's head, but Marcus ducked and came up with a brutal elbow to the man's jaw. The impact sent him stumbling back, blood spraying from his mouth, but he stayed on his feet. These men had nothing left to lose. They weren't going down easy. Vasquez recovered fast, launching himself at Marcus. They hit the pavement hard, rolling across the asphalt as fists flew. Marcus felt the dull ache of a punch against his ribs, but he ignored it, driving his knee into Vasquez's stomach before shoving him off. He barely had time to move before Monroe came at him again, this time with a rusted crowbar he must have grabbed from the truck. Marcus dodged the first swing, barely missing a skull-cracking blow. The second swing came fast, but Marcus stepped inside the arc, grabbing Monroe's wrist and twisting. The fugitive snarled, fighting against the hold, but Marcus drove his other fist into his throat. Monroe choked, stumbled, and Marcus finished it with a brutal knee to the face. The fugitive collapsed, unconscious, before he hit the ground. Marcus turned just in time to see Vasquez scrambling for the gun he had dropped earlier. He reached for it, but before his fingers could close around the grip, Conway's boot slammed down on his wrist, pinning it to the pavement. Vasquez let out a ragged breath, glaring up at her. Conway leveled her gun at him. "You're done." Vasquez let out a slow breath, his body going slack. He knew it was over. Marcus straightened, breathing heavily as he looked at the 2 downed fugitives. 2 out of 8. That was a start. The other agents moved in, securing both men in restraints, as Conway relayed the update over the radio. 2 fugitives in custody. The rest are still moving. Marcus exhaled, scanning the gas station. The hostage wasn't here. That meant the remaining fugitives, including Bull Howard, had taken her somewhere else. One of the agents pulled Monroe's phone from his pocket and handed it to Marcus. "Might be something useful on here." Marcus flipped it open. There was one recent text sent 10 minutes ago. "Meet us at the cabin. No cops." Marcus's grip tightened around the device. He turned to Conway. "We just found where they're hiding." She nodded, her expression grim. "Then let's finish this." The convoy tore down the winding dirt road, kicking up dust as the headlights cut through the thick tree line. The tension inside the SUV was suffocating. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, gripping the armrest as Conway pushed the vehicle faster, her knuckles white against the wheel. They had the location. They were close, but something didn't feel right. The coordinates pulled from Monroe's phone had led them deep into the woods, miles away from any major roads. It was the perfect place to disappear. If the fugitives had chosen this as their hideout, it meant they weren't planning to move again anytime soon. The problem was the timing. Monroe's text had gone out only 10 minutes before the fight at the gas station. If Howard and the rest of the group were there, why hadn't they run the second they realized some of their men had been taken? They were ruthless, not stupid. Marcus glanced at the tactical team riding in the SUV behind them. Agents were locked in, ready for a fight. They were expecting a firefight, an ambush. But something about this felt off. Conway's voice cut through his thoughts. We do this smart. No unnecessary risks. If they're inside, we contain them. If we don't see movement, we breach and clear. No hesitation. Marcus gave a tight nod. If they're still here, she shot him a glance, but didn't argue. She was thinking the same thing. The cabin appeared ahead, barely visible in the dim moonlight. It was small, old, and tucked deep within the trees, an abandoned hunting lodge from the looks of it. No vehicles were parked outside, no movement. The place looked dead. Conway slowed the SUV, stopping a safe distance away. The other vehicles followed suit, their lights cutting off. Silence settled in. The agents moved swiftly, fanning out to surround the cabin. Marcus and Conway moved up the dirt path, weapons drawn, keeping close to the tree line. Still no movement, no sounds inside. Marcus's instincts screamed at him. Conway reached the porch first, pressing her back against the wooden frame as she glanced at him. He gave her a short nod before stepping to the other side of the door. One of the tactical agents moved in, shotgun raised, prepared to breach. On Conway's signal, the agent kicked the door open. Nothing. The cabin was empty. Marcus moved in first, sweeping his weapon across the dark interior. The room was sparse. An old wooden table, a few chairs, dust-covered counters. A single mattress lay in the corner, the sheets rumpled as if someone had been there recently. But the space was cold. Marcus's stomach tightened. They were too late. Conway stepped in behind him, scanning the room. No food, no supplies. This wasn't a hideout. It was a waypoint. Marcus checked the table, spotting an ashtray filled with cigarette butts. They had been here, but they hadn't stayed long. He moved toward the back door, nudging it open with his boot. The ground outside was covered in fresh tire tracks. He exhaled sharply. They were here, not long ago. An agent's voice crackled over the radio. No sign of movement in the area. No additional vehicles spotted on nearby roads. Marcus clenched his fists. Howard was smart. Too smart. He had baited them here just long enough to disappear again. Conway muttered a curse under her breath. This was a dead end. Marcus shook his head. Not entirely. He looked back at her, his expression hard. We still have 2 of them in custody. Her eyes narrowed. You think Monroe and Vasquez know where Howard is heading next? Marcus nodded. And if they don't, we'll make sure they remember. Conway's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Then we get them talking. Marcus took one last look at the empty cabin before following her back outside. The trail had gone cold here, but the hunt wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The holding cells at the FBI field office were as sterile and cold as the rest of the facility. But Marcus wasn't interested in the walls, the buzzing fluorescent lights, or the security cameras monitoring every move. His focus was on the 2 men shackled to opposite sides of the interrogation room. Rick Monroe and Eddie Vasquez sat slumped in their chairs, hands cuffed to the metal table in front of them. They had been given just enough medical attention to keep them stable. But the bruises on their faces and the stiffness in their movements showed they were still feeling the aftermath of the gas station fight. Neither had spoken since their arrest. Marcus stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Conway leaned against the wall, flipping through a case file, deliberately ignoring them, letting the silence stretch and weigh on them. This wasn't about immediate threats anymore. This was a psychological game. These men were violent criminals, used to control through force. But now they had no power, no leverage. Monroe cracked first. He exhaled sharply, shifting against his restraints, his frustration barely contained. I'm not saying a damn thing, he muttered, jaw tight. Marcus finally moved, stepping forward and pulling out the chair across from him. The metal scraping loudly against the tile. He sat down, leveling Monroe with a stare that was void of any emotion. "That's fine," he said simply. "You don't have to talk." Monroe sneered. "Then why am I here?" Marcus ignored the question and glanced at Vasquez, who was keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact. Good. He was already breaking. Conway finally spoke, her tone flat. "Here's how this works. You tell us where Howard took the hostage, and maybe we make sure you don't spend the next 40 years in a federal prison eating garbage off a tray. You don't talk, and you'll be lucky if you ever see daylight again." Monroe scoffed, shaking his head. "You think that scares me?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. "You should be scared, because Howard doesn't need you anymore." He let the words sink in, watching Monroe's smirk slowly fade. "You ever wonder why he let you and Vasquez stay behind at that gas station? Why he didn't tell you to keep moving?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because you were expendable." Vasquez swallowed hard. Marcus saw it, the tiny flinch of realization. He knew it was true. Monroe shifted in his seat. "Howard's got a plan." "He always has a plan." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, he does. And part of that plan was ditching you the second you became a liability. He sent that last text, knowing you'd be caught, because all he needed was time." Conway folded her arms. "So the real question is, do you want to go down with him, or do you want to help yourself?" Monroe clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. He was stubborn, but Vasquez was already cracking. His breathing had changed, his posture tenser. Marcus turned to him, seizing on the opportunity. "You know where he's going, don't you?" he said, his tone softer now, coaxing the answer out. "You're not stupid, Vasquez. Howard didn't tell you everything, but he told you enough. You know the next stop. And if we don't get there first, that hostage is dead." Vasquez exhaled, his head dropping. His knee bounced under the table, a nervous tick. He was on the edge. Monroe turned toward him sharply. "Don't say a damn word." Vasquez snapped his head up, glaring. "Shut up, man. Howard left us. You think he's gonna bust us out when this is over? He's got his own play, and we're not in it." He turned toward Marcus, his jaw tightening. "He's heading for the quarry." Marcus and Conway exchanged glances. The quarry. Conway leaned in. "Where?" Vasquez exhaled. "Outside of Mill Creek. Abandoned years ago. Howard's got contacts there. People who can get him out of the country if he plays it right. That's where he's going to make the trade." Marcus's eyes darkened. The trade. The hostage was leverage. Howard wasn't just running. He was negotiating an exit. Conway stood abruptly, already reaching for her radio. "We move now." Marcus pushed back his chair, his pulse steady, his mind already calculating the next steps. They were finally closing in. The manhunt was about to end. The convoy sped down the highway, cutting through the night like a storm rolling in. The tension inside the lead SUV was thick, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his mind running through the names of the men still on the loose. Bull Howard, Nate Clarkson, Terry Boone, Wayne Lasky, and Daniel Holt. They had taken down 3 fugitives already, Grady, Monroe, and Vasquez, but 5 were still out there. Howard and his crew were at the quarry. That much was certain. But Holt? He was the outlier. No recent sightings. No new leads. It was as if he had vanished. Marcus exhaled sharply. Something's off about this. Conway kept her eyes on the road, but he could tell she was thinking the same thing. Yeah. A high-level fixer like Carter doesn't get involved in a simple prison break. The question is, why these guys? What made them worth the effort? Marcus shook his head. Howard's the most dangerous, but he's predictable. Boone and Lasky are low-level thugs. And Clarkson? He's got a history of armed robberies, but nothing that makes him special. He paused. And then there's Holt. Conway flicked a glance toward him. He's the only one we haven't spotted since the breakout. Marcus nodded. That's not an accident. Either he's the one they were really after, or he's making moves on his own. And if we don't have eyes on him, that means someone helped him disappear. Conway's grip on the steering wheel tightened. If that's true, we've been looking at this all wrong. Marcus exhaled slowly. That's what's bothering me. We assumed this was about Howard because he's the loudest. But if Carter was involved, That means one of these men was worth risking everything to break out. Conway's voice was tight. And we don't know which one yet. Marcus clenched his fists. But we're about to find out. The radio crackled with a surveillance update. Approaching the quarry. Multiple vehicles on site. No visible movement. Conway floored the accelerator, sending the SUV roaring down the dirt road leading into the pit. The old quarry stretched out ahead. A vast open wound in the earth, abandoned for years. 4 vehicles sat parked at the bottom. 2 pickup trucks, an older sedan, and a black SUV. Marcus scanned the area. No guards posted, no movement. Just the silent glow of headlights reflecting off the rock walls. Everything was too quiet. Conway keyed her radio. All units, stay sharp. This could go sideways fast. Marcus checked his weapon one last time, his pulse steady. The manhunt was about to end, and he wasn't leaving without the hostage. The quarry was silent, a dead stillness settling over the pit as the fugitives realized the noose had finally tightened around them. FBI agents were positioned along the ridges above, cutting off every possible escape route. Floodlights mounted on tactical vehicles bathed the rocky terrain in an artificial glow, illuminating Bull Howard and the last of his men. Marcus crouched behind a rusted-out loader, his weapon steady in his hands as he watched Howard. The hostage was still alive, still breathing, but Howard wasn't letting go. She knelt near the black SUV, wrists bound behind her back, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Boone, Lasky, and Clarkson stood close, gripping their weapons, their backs tense. Howard's face was unreadable, but Marcus caught the twitch of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked upward toward the ridges. He was calculating, waiting, expecting something. Marcus exhaled slowly. He's waiting for someone to bail him out. Conway's voice crackled through his earpiece. He still thinks there's a way out of this. Marcus nodded slightly. Then we need to show him he's alone. Howard finally spoke, his deep voice booming across the pit. You think you got us cornered? He let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. You don't know who you're dealing with. Marcus kept his aim steady but said nothing. Howard glanced at his men. We hold tight. Stick to the plan. His voice was firm, but his men didn't respond right away. Boone's fingers twitched around his rifle. Lasky shifted on his feet. Even Clarkson looked uneasy. That's when it hit Marcus. They already knew. Howard's voice lost its edge, the confidence draining from his face. They'll be here, he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the road leading into the pit. Any second now, but nothing happened. No engines in the distance, no backup coming over the ridge, nothing. Howard froze, his grip tightening on the pistol at his side. His breathing changed. For the first time since the breakout, Bull Howard looked unsure. Conway must have seen it too, because her voice came sharp through Marcus's earpiece. He's realizing it. Marcus took a slow breath. He was expecting someone to pull him out of this. Conway's silence told him she had reached the same conclusion. Howard wasn't the real target of the escape. The truth was sinking into him now, deeper than any bullet ever could. No one was coming for him. He had been used. Howard's eyes darted to his men, but they were already processing it too. Boone glanced at Lasky, uncertainty flickering between them. Clarkson swallowed hard, gripping his rifle, his hands clammy. Lasky spoke first. Boss, what if nobody's coming? Howard's head snapped toward him, his jaw clenching. Shut up. Clarkson's voice wavered. He's right, man. If they were going to help us, they'd be here by now. Boone took a small step back, his grip tightening on his weapon. What if this was the plan all along? We make all the noise, and they slip away while we get left behind? Howard's breath came sharper now, his nostrils flaring. Marcus saw it happening in real time. The shift, the slow collapse of the illusion Howard had built for himself. This wasn't a prison break for him. This wasn't about him getting a second chance. This was a distraction. And now he knew it. His face twisted with fury, veins bulging at his temples as he turned on his own men. You want to run? You think you got a better shot out there than with me? Fine. Walk. His voice was a snarl, but it wasn't enough to hide the panic creeping into his words. Marcus saw his opening. He stepped out from cover, weapon raised, his voice cold. "It's over, Howard. You've got no one left. Whoever you were waiting for. They don't care about you." Howard's head snapped toward him. His eyes burned, his chest heaving. "Shut your damn mouth!" Marcus took another step forward. "Face it, you weren't the one they wanted out. You were just the loudest, the easiest to track." Howard's grip on the hostage tightened, but Marcus didn't stop. "They needed a distraction," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "And you gave them one." The words hit like a hammer. Howard's eyes widened slightly before fury drowned out the realization. His hand tightened on the weapon, pressing it against the hostage's skull. "Back the hell up!" Howard roared, his body vibrating with rage and betrayal. Conway's voice came through Marcus's earpiece. "He's unraveling." Marcus could hear the urgency in her tone. The situation was seconds from turning into bloodshed. Howard's eyes flicked to his men again, looking for something, anything. But Boone and Lasky were backing away now, seeing the truth in real time. Clarkson swallowed hard. His grip on his rifle loosened slightly. "Bull, listen, man, we can still—" Howard snapped. He fired. The bullet wasn't aimed at the hostage. It was aimed at Clarkson. The younger fugitive staggered back, clutching his side as blood bloomed against his shirt. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the side of a truck. Everything exploded at once. Gunfire erupted from both sides as the FBI agents opened fire. Boone and Lasky immediately ducked for cover, their weapons barking in retaliation. Conway shouted orders over the radio, directing tactical units to contain the chaos. Howard jerked the hostage backward, dragging her toward the black SUV. Marcus moved. He sprinted forward, bullets kicking up dust around him as he closed the distance. Boone swung his rifle in Marcus's direction, but a single shot from a sniper above took him down before he could pull the trigger. Two left. Lasky broke for one of the trucks, but FBI agents moved in from the side, pinning him down with gunfire. One left. Howard had reached the SUV, shoving the hostage inside, fumbling with the keys as he tried to get the engine running. Marcus didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the driver's side door and ripping it open. Howard turned, face twisted with rage, his massive frame moving fast as he swung a brutal right hook. Marcus barely ducked in time, feeling the air shift past his face as the punch whipped just inches from his jaw. Howard wasn't running anymore. He was fighting, and Marcus was ready for it. Howard swung again, a wild, powerful punch that could have shattered bone if it connected, but Marcus was already moving, twisting his body just out of range before retaliating with a sharp elbow to Howard's ribs. The impact landed solid, forcing a grunt from the fugitive's throat, but it wasn't enough to slow him down. Howard was big, too big to take down with a single well-placed strike, and Marcus knew this fight wasn't going to be quick. The massive fugitive barely flinched before surging forward again, using his sheer weight to slam Marcus against the side of the SUV, knocking the wind out of his lungs with a crushing impact. The hostage inside let out a muffled cry, her terrified eyes peering through the window as the fight raged just outside. Marcus barely had time to brace before Howard grabbed him by the collar and hurled him backward, sending him crashing onto the rocky dirt. Pain flared along his spine as he rolled, barely managing to push himself back onto his feet before Howard came at him again. There was no finesse to Howard's attacks, just brute force and the confidence of a man who had spent his life winning fights with nothing but size and violence. He threw another punch, this one lower, aimed at Marcus's ribs, but Marcus sidestepped at the last second, forcing Howard's momentum forward before landing a brutal kick to the back of his knee. Howard stumbled, but he didn't go down. Instead, he twisted, grabbing a fistful of Marcus's vest and yanking him forward with terrifying strength. Marcus barely got his arms up before Howard's forehead crashed into his skull, a savage headbutt that sent a shock wave of pain exploding behind his eyes. He staggered back, vision swimming, but forced himself to stay upright. Howard wasn't stopping. He moved in again, swinging a heavy fist toward Marcus's temple, but this time Marcus was ready. He ducked low, stepped inside Howard's reach, and drove a vicious uppercut into his ribs, followed by a brutal elbow to the side of his face. The impact rocked Howard's head sideways, blood spraying from his split lip. But still, he didn't fall. Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't. He drove a knee into Howard's gut, grabbed the back of his head, and slammed it into the SUV's door. The metal dented from the impact, Howard's skull bouncing off with a sickening crack. But he kept fighting. With a roar of pure fury, Howard threw his full weight forward, tackling Marcus and driving him straight into the gravel, pinning him down with an unforgiving grip. Marcus barely had time to throw his arms up before a massive fist crashed into the side of his face. Pain exploded across his jaw, then another punch, and another. Each strike sent shockwaves through Marcus's skull, his vision blurring with every impact. Howard wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to break him. The world narrowed to pain, heat, and the taste of copper in Marcus's mouth. But even as Howard loomed over him, fists ready to keep hammering down, Marcus refused to go down like this. With every ounce of strength he had left, he twisted sharply, breaking Howard's hold just enough to slam an open palm into his throat. Howard choked, gagging, his body jerking back just long enough for Marcus to explode upward. He shoved Howard off, rolling to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Howard coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt, but the fury never left his eyes. "You think you're gonna take me down?" he snarled, his voice raw. "You ain't the first to try." Marcus wiped blood from his mouth, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "I'll be the last." Howard charged again, but this time Marcus was done playing defense. He sidestepped at the last second, hooked his arm under Howard's, and used the fugitive's own weight against him, flipping him forward and sending him crashing onto his back with a violent thud. Before Howard could roll, Marcus was already on him, straddling his chest, fists flying. One punch, another, and another. Each hit was calculated, ruthless, meant to break Howard down piece by piece. Blood smeared across his knuckles, but Marcus didn't stop. Not until Howard's wild thrashing finally slowed. Not until his grunts of rage turned into groans of pain. Not until he stopped fighting. Marcus sat back, panting hard, his body aching, his knuckles raw. Howard wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't getting up either. He lay on the dirt, his face a bloody mess, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The fight had been beaten out of him. A sharp voice cut through the ringing in Marcus's ears. "Put your hands where we can see them!" FBI agents swarmed the scene, weapons raised, tactical boots crunching against the gravel as they moved in to secure Howard. Conway was among them, her gun trained on Lasky, who had already dropped his weapon, his hands raised in surrender. Marcus let out a long, steady breath. It was over. Howard let out a ragged, wet cough, his swollen eyes barely opening as he muttered, "You should have killed me." Marcus shook his head. "Not my job." A pair of agents grabbed Howard's arms, yanking him to his feet as he let out a low grunt of pain. His knees nearly buckled, but they kept him upright, dragging him toward one of the armored FBI vehicles. Marcus turned, his gaze immediately landing on the SUV. The hostage was still inside, staring through the window, her body trembling but alive. Conway stepped beside him, her breath heavy but controlled. "We got 'em all." Marcus didn't answer right away, his gaze sweeping the quarry, his mind already moving past the fight. Something wasn't sitting right. This wasn't over. Not really. Conway seemed to pick up on it. "What?" Marcus exhaled. "Holt." Conway's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking toward the unconscious bodies of Howard's men. "He wasn't here." Marcus finally turned to her. "No, because this was never about him." The words hung heavy in the air. The manhunt was over, but the real threat was still out there. The dust hadn't fully settled over the quarry, but the fight was over. Howard was in cuffs. Boone was dead. Clarkson was being stabilized by medics, and Lasky had given up without another shot fired. The FBI agents moved methodically, securing the crime scene, zip-tying the remaining fugitives, and collecting evidence from the vehicles they had used. The once quiet pit was now filled with the steady hum of voices, the occasional squawk of radios, and the metallic clang of equipment being gathered. Marcus stood near the black SUV, his muscles aching, his knuckles raw and split, watching as agents cut the hostage's restraints. She was shaking, her skin pale, but she was alive. Conway stepped beside him, arms crossed as she surveyed the scene. Medics say she's in shock, but otherwise unharmed. She's lucky, Marcus exhaled. Could have gone a lot worse. The woman, still trembling, looked up at them, her eyes darting between the agents before locking onto Marcus. You... Her voice cracked, her throat raw from hours of fear. You stopped him. Marcus gave a small nod. You're safe now. Her lips quivered, but she swallowed hard, fighting back the emotion. The agent beside her asked if she was ready to be taken to the medics, and she nodded shakily, allowing herself to be led away. It was over for her. But for Marcus and Conway, it wasn't. Conway let out a slow breath, running a hand through her hair before glancing toward the FBI transport vehicle, where Howard sat slumped against the seat, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes still burning with something ugly. We're not done, she muttered. Marcus followed her gaze. Howard was finished, but the real fight was still ahead. They turned as one of the agents approached, his expression grim. We need to talk. Marcus didn't like the tone. What is it? The agent hesitated before handing Conway a phone. Howard's phone. We ran a quick scan through his recent messages, the agent said. One of the texts he sent after the breakout finally went through when we entered the area. Conway frowned as she scrolled through the screen. Then her body stiffened. Marcus immediately stepped closer. What? She turned the phone toward him, her voice tight. It's not a message to any of his guys. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he read the screen. The text was sent to a burner number. The message was short, but it said everything. They left us. What the hell is going on? Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He already knew the answer. Howard wasn't just betrayed. He was never part of the real plan. Conway exhaled sharply. This wasn't about him. It was never about him. Marcus's gaze turned toward the fugitives still in custody. Where's Holt? The agent shifted uncomfortably. No sign of him. No bodies. No vehicles matching his description. No chatter on any channels about him being seen. It's like he disappeared. Marcus clenched his jaw. That wasn't possible. No fugitive, no matter how careful, could just vanish without help. Conway was already putting it together. If Howard was expecting someone to pull him out, and they never came, then whoever orchestrated this was only after one thing. Marcus nodded. Holt. They had spent the last 24 hours hunting the wrong men, playing into someone else's plan, chasing ghosts, while the real target slipped into the wind. Howard was big, loud, and violent. The perfect distraction. Holt was quiet, methodical, and now he was gone. Marcus turned back toward the FBI transport vehicle where Howard sat, staring at the ground, his expression dark. Marcus took a step forward, his voice low but sharp. Who set you up? Howard didn't answer. Marcus stepped closer, his presence looming over the beaten man. Who the hell were you waiting for? Howard's bloodied lips curled into a bitter smirk. You tell me, Agent. Marcus's fists tightened. Howard didn't know. He had been played just as hard as the FBI. Conway let out a slow, frustrated exhale. We need to get him to a secure site and get everyone into interrogation. Maybe someone knows something about Holt's next move. Marcus didn't respond right away. His mind was already racing ahead, piecing the puzzle together. Holt had someone on the outside, someone powerful, someone who had the resources to not only orchestrate the breakout, but to make sure the only man that mattered walked away clean. The manhunt wasn't over. The drive back to the FBI field office was quiet, tense, and heavy with the weight of unfinished business. The fugitive roundup had been a success, at least on paper. Bull Howard and his remaining crew were in custody, the hostage was safe, and the prison break had been contained. But none of that mattered, because Holt was gone. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of the SUV, eyes locked on the darkened landscape rushing past the windows, his thoughts circling like vultures. He had spent years tracking down men like Howard, violent criminals, predictable in their recklessness, the kind of men who didn't have the patience for real strategy. But Holt was different. He hadn't vanished on luck alone. Someone had orchestrated this down to the last second. And that meant one thing. Holt wasn't just running. He had a plan. Conway drove, her grip tight on the wheel, her jaw clenched in frustration. "We wasted time chasing Howard while the real guy walked," she muttered, the anger sharp in her voice. "Whoever was behind this played us like a damn instrument." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then we start playing back." Conway didn't ask what he meant. They were already thinking the same thing. William Carter, the fixer, the mystery man in the suit, the one loose thread they hadn't pulled on hard enough. He had facilitated the breakout, moved in powerful circles, and stayed eerily calm even when he was being arrested, because he knew something. And now, it was time to make him talk. By the time they reached the FBI field office, it was past midnight, but the facility was still humming with energy. The interrogation rooms were full, agents processing the fugitives, intelligence analysts poring over data, trying to backtrack every move the escapees had made since breaking free. But none of that mattered. Carter was the priority. They found him sitting alone in a stark, windowless room, his hands cuffed to the table, his posture relaxed like he had been expecting them. The dim overhead light cast long shadows over his sharp, unreadable face. He was still in the same crisp suit, though it was slightly wrinkled now, a faint smudge of dirt near his sleeve, the only visible sign that his day hadn't gone as planned. As soon as Marcus and Conway entered the room, Carter's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I was wondering when you'd stop playing cops and robbers with those idiots and come see me," he said, his voice smooth, unbothered. "I assume you finally realized I'm the only person in this building who knows what's really going on." Marcus didn't sit down. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward, his gaze drilling into Carter's. "Where's Holt?" Carter's smirk didn't waver. "Now see, that's the right question. Took you long enough to ask it." Conway crossed her arms. "We're done with the games. You're up to your neck in this. The only way you're walking out of here is if you start giving us something useful." Carter tilted his head slightly, considering her words before letting out a soft chuckle. "See? That's where you're mistaken. I'm already walking out of here." Marcus felt the shift in the air before he even understood why. Conway stiffened beside him, her eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" Carter stretched his fingers, as if he wasn't cuffed to the table in an interrogation room, but merely enjoying a conversation. "I've been here for hours, sitting, waiting. Not one lawyer, not one official charge. Why? Because you don't actually have anything on me? The second your superiors finish their review, I'll be out the front door." Marcus's fists curled against the metal table. "You're an accessory to a federal prison escape. That's more than enough to hold you." Carter chuckled again, shaking his head. "You're thinking small. Do you really believe I pulled strings for some low-level criminals? Howard was a fool. You think I'd risk exposure for a bunch of violent, disposable men?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I was never working for them. I was working for Holt." Conway's expression hardened. "Then you better start talking." Carter sighed, shifting in his chair like this was all a tedious inconvenience. "Here's what I'll give you for free. Holt wasn't just another prisoner. He wasn't even supposed to be caught. He was an asset, valuable, connected, and more importantly, protected. Someone high up didn't want him sitting in a federal cell, so they used Howard as a smokescreen. Make enough noise, draw enough attention, let the FBI get caught up in a manhunt while the real target slips through the cracks." Marcus's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about an escaped fugitive. This was bigger, much bigger. Conway pulled out a file, flipping it open and shoving it in front of Carter. It contained every known detail about Holt. his suspected connections to international arms dealers, rogue military contractors, private security firms that had a habit of working in legal gray areas. "Tell me who wanted him out," she demanded. Carter tapped his fingers against the table, glancing at the file with mild interest. "Now, see, that's the part where it's going to cost you." Marcus's patience snapped. He grabbed Carter by the collar and yanked him forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You're out of leverage, Carter. You're going to tell us everything you know, or I swear to God, I'll make sure you never get a deal. You'll rot in a hole so deep, you'll forget what daylight looks like." Carter's smile didn't fade, but something in his eyes sharpened. A flicker of amusement, turning into something else. "You think I'm afraid of prison?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've been playing this game longer than you, Agent. You're thinking in terms of charges, arrests, convictions. I think in terms of power. And right now, I still have more than you." Marcus held his gaze for a long, tense moment. Then he let go, stepping back. "Fine. You think you're untouchable? Let's see how long that lasts." Carter smoothed out his suit, his confidence unshaken. "I'd be more worried about how long you last. Because now that Holt's out, you're on borrowed time." Marcus and Conway exchanged a glance. Carter wasn't lying. This wasn't just about an escaped fugitive anymore. This was about who had helped him, and what Holt was planning next. The halls of the FBI field office buzzed with energy, agents moving in and out of briefing rooms, analysts poring over intelligence reports, the hum of printers spitting out freshly compiled data. But for Marcus and Conway, the rest of the noise barely registered. Their focus was locked onto the one name that mattered: Daniel Holt. Carter had confirmed what they already suspected. Holt was never supposed to be caught, and someone powerful had just corrected that mistake. But what Carter hadn't given them was a trail to follow. Holt had slipped off the radar the moment he walked free, and that meant whoever was protecting him had the resources to make him disappear completely. Marcus sat in the main operations room, his eyes scanning the files spread out across the table, each document a piece of Holt's fractured history. Conway stood beside him, flipping through the latest intelligence reports, her expression tight with frustration. "We're blind," she muttered, tossing a file onto the table. "No financial transactions, no known associates making any unusual moves. Nothing on satellite surveillance, no chatter on the wire. It's like he never existed." Marcus exhaled slowly. That was exactly the problem. Holt wasn't a common fugitive. He wasn't some thug who would get desperate and leave a trail of bad decisions. He was a professional, a ghost. And if someone had gone to this much trouble to extract him, then he wasn't just running. He was heading somewhere specific. A low beep from one of the analyst stations made Conway turn. The lead technician, a young woman named Reyes, looked up from her monitor. "We might have something," she said, her voice cautious. "Pulled old flagged communications from Holt's known contacts, stuff that didn't seem important at the time. But there's a pattern." Marcus and Conway stepped over, eyes scanning the data as it flashed across the screen. Reyes pointed to a series of messages, coded exchanges buried in otherwise ordinary emails from months before Holt's arrest. "This phrasing here, it's not random. This is a travel route," Conway frowned. "A travel route to where?" Reyes typed quickly, cross-referencing flight records, customs logs, and known aliases Holt had used in the past. After a few tense seconds, a location popped onto the screen. "Istanbul," Reyes said. Marcus's jaw tightened. "He's running international." Conway exhaled sharply. "And someone is making damn sure he gets there clean." Reyes clicked another tab, pulling up an encrypted message that had been flagged earlier in the night. "There's more. We intercepted this 2 hours ago. The encryption was tough, but we cracked part of it. It mentions an arrangement completed and departure imminent." Marcus and Conway exchanged a look. Holt was already moving. Conway